Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a highly provocative, incredibly fascinating editorial argument. We're looking at a source text titled, Islam as a Theological Counterfeit, a Structural Examination. Now, right out of the gate, I want to be crystal clear with you. We are absolutely not taking political sides here, and we aren't wading into any modern geopolitical debates. The goal of this explainer is simply to objectively unpack the structural mechanics of these two major faiths, doing so strictly from the Christian epistemic framework presented by the original author. Basically, we're popping the hood to look at the architecture of belief, impartially dissecting the logic exactly as it's laid out in the text. Let's get into it.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start by defining the counterfeit, then move right into the Christological fault line. After that, we'll cover expansions, persuasion versus power, followed by ontologies, love versus submission. And finally, we'll wrap things up with rival gospels and some really interesting practical insights.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, defining the counterfeit, setting the framework.
To truly grasp the text's argument, we have to look closely at how it defines its most critical term. You see, a theological counterfeit isn't just a dismissal of another religion's existence. Think about it like a counterfeit $100 bill. A fake bell drawn on a piece of blue notebook paper with a crayon? That's not dangerous to the treasury, because nobody is fooled by it. The real danger comes from a fake that uses the exact same paper blend, the same ink, and the very same portraits. The source's linchpin concept here is that a counterfeit's danger lies entirely in its deceptive similarity. Unlike paganism or secularism, which are openly, obviously different, a theological counterfeit creates what the author calls deceptive proximity. It uses the exact same language and familiar figures, but actually possesses a fundamentally opposed core nature.
So how does this actually play out in practice? Well, the source lays out these specific criteria, which it draws directly from the New Testament, using them as an analytical lens. First, the system employs biblical figures to establish its legitimacy. If a new movement says, hey, we believe in Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, it instantly lowers your defenses, right? It creates familiarity. Second, it claims continuity. The text calls this the yes, but maneuver. It claims to be the next logical chapter, but, and here's the third point, it displaces the original meaning of those historical characters. Finally, it introduces an entirely alternative revelation that essentially nullifies the completed work of Christ. The text argues that this acts as a structural warning system, a way to test whether a belief system is a subtle counterfeit or just a completely alien religion.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Christological fault line, where the systems collide.
The editorial now takes this exact diagnostic test and applies it directly to the central, absolute, non-negotiable figure of both religions, Jesus. And the author points out Islam's historically anomalous treatment of him. On one hand, Islam affirms massive, world-altering supernatural claims about Jesus, the virgin birth, his miracles, his official title as Messiah, and even his future return. But on the flip side, it vehemently denies the incarnation, the crucifixion, the atonement, and the resurrection. The author highlights what a fascinating theological paradox this is. I mean, think about it, affirming a supernatural origin, like a virgin birth, but completely denying the redemptive purpose of that origin. From the source's strictly Christian framework, the items being denied aren't just minor peripheral details. They are literally the entire engine of the Christian gospel.
Which brings us to this incredibly sticky, brilliant takeaway phrase from the editorial: honor retained, meaning removed. The source argues that Islam strategically keeps the impressive titles and the outward shell of respect for Jesus to gain theological legitimacy. And it's true, you will never hear a devout Muslim mock Jesus. The honor is meticulously retained. But according to this structural analysis, it surgically strips away the underlying theological meaning of his entire mission. It's kind of like admiring a classic car for its gorgeous paint job while actively denying that its engine even exists. The symbol is kept, but it's totally evacuated of its original redemptive substance.
To wrap our heads around how this functions, we need to look at how each faith views previous texts. Christianity relies on fulfillment. It leans heavily on the Old Testament, stating that Jesus is the culmination of progressive revelation. It doesn't replace the Old, it fulfills it. Islam, however, relies on supersession. The source brilliantly describes this as a borrow-to-replace strategy. Think about the logic. For the Quran to be the ultimate final truth that denies the crucifixion, the New Testament must logically be false. Therefore, Islam structurally relies on the doctrine of corruption, known as tarhif, which claims previous scriptures were physically altered by Christians. The text argues this is absolutely necessary for Islam to justify its own existence and ultimately nullify the cross.
This brings us to Section 3, expansions. Persuasion versus power, the historical test. So, what does this all mean when these opposing theologies actually hit the ground in history? Well, the source frames Christianity's early history not as a historical accident, but as a rigid theological necessity. For its first 300 years, Christianity was this marginalized, heavily persecuted minority. No army, no state power. It spread entirely through apostolic persuasion, testimony, and completely voluntary martyrdom right up until the Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalized it. Why does the author highlight this? Because they argue that a faith grounded purely in grace and the inward transformation of the human heart simply cannot, by its very nature, be compelled by a sword. Coercion is explicitly fundamentally incompatible with a theology of voluntary love.
Now contrast that timeline with the historical mapping of Islam's emergence. Right from the get-go in the 7th century, the source details an immediate fusion of religious, political, and social authority. The prophet wasn't just a spiritual teacher, he was the head of state, the chief justice, and the commander of the army. This formed the Ummah, a religious political community from day one. And what immediately followed was rapid military expansion and conquest under the early caliphates. The editorial argues this integration wasn't just a historical quirk, it was the exact required mechanism to establish divine sovereignty and enforce a comprehensive legal order across society.
The text then applies what it calls the spirit test, looking at where the religion actually lives inside a person. Christianity prioritizes internal transformation and the individual conscience. Because of this, leaving the faith, or apostasy, is viewed as a heartbreaking spiritual tragedy, but traditionally not a crime against the state. You just can't force someone to genuinely love God. Islam, conversely, prioritizes external alignment with a divine legal code to maintain strict communal order. In classical jurisprudence, apostasy was traditionally treated as outright treason against the state, because it was a literal defection from the social and legal structure. As the source beautifully and concisely puts it, one system aims to build cathedrals of the heart, while the other builds citadels of law.
Okay, moving into Section 4, Ontologies, Love versus Submission, the deepest philosophical divide. Let's dig even deeper into this architectural blueprint. You see, these wildly different historical methods of expansion are actually rooted in fundamentally different views of reality itself. That's what ontology means, the fundamental nature of being. The text argues that the Christian ontology is incarnational and participatory. It envisions a highly relational God who actually enters history, taking on human flesh and physically suffering for creation to restore communion with it. The Islamic ontology, however, is defined by tawhid, absolute divine unity, absolute sovereignty, and radical transcendence. In this view, God is utterly incomparable, and the gap between the creator and the created is totally unbridgeable. God doesn't enter history in flesh. Instead, God dictates a perfect, flawless law book from on high for humanity to submit to.
And these super abstract philosophies translate directly into the everyday motives of each faith. For Christianity, the main driver is reconciliation, and the highest possible ethic is agape, sacrificial love. It operates on this God-man model, aiming for an eschatological renewal, a literal new creation. For Islam, the main driver is alignment with the divine will, and the governing ethic is fiqh, law and justice. It operates on a sovereign servant model, where the ultimate goal is final judgment and right standing before a supreme sovereign judge. The source points out that you simply cannot harmonize a God who bleeds for creation to restore a relationship with a God who remains completely above it, demanding strict legal obedience.
The editorial then takes these motives and translates them into some really profound, practical societal insights. It argues that a grace-based system naturally, inevitably, trends toward cultural pluralism and a massive emphasis on individual conscience. Why? Because the state literally lacks any juridical mechanism to force internal heart transformation. On the flip side, a juridical system centered on submission naturally trends toward strong, unified, legal communal cohesion. It requires integrated governance to maintain that legal uniformity. The author stresses a crucial point here. These historical and cultural trajectories aren't accidents. They are the logical, natural outworkings of their foundational assumptions about God and humanity.
Finally, we hit Section 5, Rival Gospels and Practical Insights, the final asymmetry.
Let's see how this all builds toward the text's ultimate, unyielding conclusion. The source cuts right through the fog of polite interfaith dialogue with what it calls the Christological logic model. And it is a ruthless, logical binary. Point 1. If Jesus actually is God incarnate, as Christianity claims, then Islam is structurally false. Point 2. If Jesus is not God incarnate, then Christianity is entirely false based on idolatry. The conclusion is incredibly stark. There is absolutely no harmonizing middle ground here. We are dealing with mutually exclusive, non-negotiable truth claims about the exact same historical person. They literally cannot both be true.
Which brings us to a fascinating, undeniable piece of structural evidence, the asymmetry of reinterpretation. The author points out that Christianity stands completely independent. It does not need to reinterpret or even mention the historical figure of Muhammad for its theology to work perfectly. But Islam has a one-way structural dependency. It absolutely must reinterpret Jesus and aggressively explain away the cross in order to justify its own existence as the final revelation. The text argues that this highly specific requirement to correct the record of the original faith acts as the final, definitive proof that Islam functions structurally as a theological counterfeit, completely relying on the original currency to pass itself off as an improved version.
So I'll leave you with this really provocative question posed by the editorial. Are these just parallel paths up the same mountain to the same God, or are they entirely rival gospels? Based on this structural analysis, working strictly from within a Christian framework, the source concludes this is a profound structural collision of rival gospels. They're offering entirely different diagnoses and totally opposite cures for the human condition. It's a heavy, clarifying analysis that challenges how we view these massive global systems, and honestly, it really makes you want to look closer at the architecture of the ideas governing our world. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.